our country's first 150 years, there shouldn't be any immigration policy at all. We should welcome everyone who wants to come here and work. You've changed your view.
During that campaign, I remember I got into trouble with the libertarians because I said there may well be a time when immigration is like an invasion and we have to treat it differently. And I think in one sense, with the welfare state out of control, see, my approach to immigration is somewhat different than the others. Mine is you deal with it economically. We're in worse shape now because we subsidize immigration. We give food stamps, Social Security, free medical care, free education, and amnesty. So you subsidize and you have a mess. Our hospitals are being closed. Conditions have changed. And I think that we should have, and 9/11 has occurred. Why shouldn't we be looking at people coming in? So there's, this means that we should look at immigration differently. It's an economic issue more than anything. If our economy is in good health, believe me, I don't think it'd be an immigration problem. We'd be looking for workers and we would be very generous.
You say you're a strict constructionist of the Constitution, and yet you want to amend the Constitution to say that children born here should not automatically be U.S. citizens.
Well, amending the Constitution is constitutional. What's a contradiction there?
So after the Constitution as written, you want to amend?
Well, that's constitutional to do it. Besides, it was the 14th Amendment. It wasn't the original Constitution. And there's a confusion on the interpretation. In the early years, it was never interpreted that way. And it's still confusing because individuals are supposed to have birthright citizenship if they're under the jurisdiction of the government. And somebody who illegally comes in this country as a drug dealer, is he under the jurisdiction and their children deserve citizenship? I think it's awfully confusing. And matter of fact, I have a bill to change that as well as a constitutional amendment to clarify it.
Let me ask you about drugs and go back again to your 1988 campaign and see where you stand today. All drugs should be decriminalized. Drugs should be distributed by any adult to other adults. There should be no controls or production, supply, or purchase for adults. Is that still your position?
Yeah, it's sort of like alcohol. Alcohol's a deadly drug, kills more people than anything else. And today, the absurdity on this war on drugs, Tim, has just been horrible. We now, the federal government takes over and overrules state laws where state laws permit medicinal marijuana for people dying of cancer. The federal government goes in and arrests these people, put them in prison with mandatory, sometimes life sentences. This war on drugs is totally out of control. If you want to regulate cigarettes and alcohol and drugs, it should be at the state level. That's been my position, and that's where I stand on it. But the federal government has no prerogatives on this. When they wanted to outlaw alcohol, they had enough respect for the Constitution to amend the Constitution. Today, we have all these laws and abuse, and they don't even care about the Constitution. I'm defending the Constitution on this issue. I think drugs are horrible. I teach my kids not to use them, my grandchildren, in my medical practice. Prescription drugs are greater danger than hard drugs.
But you would decriminalize?
I would, at the federal level. I don't have control of the states, and that's what the Constitution says.
Let me ask you about race, because I read a speech you gave in 2004, the 40th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act. And you said this: contrary to the claims of the supporters of the Civil Rights Act of '64, the act did not improve race relations or enhance freedom. Instead, the forced integration dictated by the Civil Rights Act of '64 increased racial tensions while diminishing individual liberty. That act gave equal rights to African Americans to vote, to live, to go to lunch counters. And you seem to be criticizing it.
Well, we should do this at a federal level. It's a federal lunch counter be okay for the military. Just think of how the government, all the segregation in the military until after World War II. But when it comes, Tim, you're not compelled in your house to invade strangers that you don't like. So it's a property rights issue. And this idea that all private property is under the domain of the federal government, I think, is wrong. So I think even Barry Goldwater opposed that bill on the same property rights position, and now this thing is totally out of control. If you happen to like to smoke a cigar, the federal government's going to come down and say you're not allowed to do this.
But you would vote if you would vote against the Civil Rights Act if it was today.
If it were written the same way, where the federal government's taken over property, it has nothing to do with race relations. It just happens, Tim, that I get more support from black people today than any other Republican candidate, according to some statistics. And I have a great appeal to people who care about personal liberties and to those individuals who would like to get us out of war. So it has nothing to do with racism. It has to do with the Constitution. and private property rights.
I was intrigued by your comments about Abe Lincoln. According to Paul, Abe Lincoln should never have gone to war. There were better ways of getting rid of slavery.
Absolutely. 600,000 Americans died in a senseless civil war. No, he shouldn't have gone to war. He did this just to enhance and get rid of the original intent of the Republic. I mean, it was an iron fist in
We'd
Washington.
still have slavery.
Oh, come on, Tim. Slavery was phased out in every other country of the world, and the way I'm advising that it should have been done is do like the British Empire did. You buy the slaves and release them. How much would that cost compared to killing 600,000 Americans and where it lingered for 100 years? I mean, the hatred and all that existed. So every other major country in the world got rid of slavery without a civil war. I mean, that doesn't sound too radical to me. That sounds like a pretty reasonable approach.
You're running as a Republican. On your website, in your brochures, you make this claim: principled leadership. Ron was also one of only 4 Republican congressmen to endorse Ronald Reagan for president against Gerald Ford in '76. There's a photograph of you, Ronald Reagan, on the right, heralding your support of Ronald Reagan. And yet, you divorced yourself from Ronald Reagan. You said this: although he was once an ardent supporter of President Reagan, Paul now speaks of him as a traitor, leading the country in the debt and conflicts around the world. I want to totally disassociate myself from the Reagan administration. And you go on to the Dallas Morning News. Paul now calls Reagan a dramatic failure.
Well, I'll bet you any money I didn't use the word traitor. I bet you that's somebody else, so I think that's misleading. But a failure, yes. In many ways, the government didn't shrink. Ultimately, after he got in office, he said, all I want to do is reduce the rate of increase in size of government. That's not my goal. My goal is to reduce our government to a constitutional size, completely different. I think that, as a matter of fact, he admitted in his memoirs that he had a total failure in Lebanon, and he said he relearned the Middle East because of that failure. And so there, you know, he.
But if he's a total failure, why are you using his picture in your brochure?
Well, because he ran on a good program, and his idea was limited government, get rid of the Department of Education, a strong national defense.
George Herbert Walker Bush, this is according to Ron Paul. Bush is a bum, Paul wrote in November 15, 1992, issue of his newsletter, The Ron Paul Political Report, and asked about the current President Bush, whether he voted for him in 2004. Paul says no, he misled us in 2000. Asked if he voted for Bush in 2000. No, I didn't vote for him then either. I wasn't convinced he was a conservative. And actually, in 1987, you submitted a letter of resignation to the Republican Party. I therefore resign my membership in the Republican Party and enclose my membership card. If Reagan's a failure, Bush 41 is a bum, and you didn't vote for Bush 41 is a bum, and 43 you didn't vote for, and you resigned from the Republican Party, why are you running for a Republican candidate for president?
Because I represent what Republicanism used to be. I represent the group that wanted to get rid of the Department of Education, the part of the Republican Party that used to be non-interventions overseas. That was the tradition, the Robert Taft wing of the party. There was a time when the Republicans defended individual liberty and the Constitution and decreased spending. So the radicals, the ones who don't really belong in the Republican Party, and why the Republican Party is shrinking, why the base is so small, is because they don't stand for these ideals anymore. So I stand for the ideals of the Republican Party. I've been elected 10 times as a Republican. I've been a Republican all my life, except for that 1 year that I ran as a Libertarian. But no, I represent the Republican ideals, I think, much more so than the individuals running for the party right now.
If you do not win the Republican nomination for president, will you run as an independent in 2008?
I have no intention to do that.
Absolute promise.
I have no intention of doing that.
Well, but no intention is a wiggle word.
Okay, I deserve one wiggle now and then, Tim. I mean, what's the devil?
So no Sherman-esque statement. I will not run as an independent.
Well, I can be pretty darn sure that I have no intention, no plans of doing it, and that's about 99.9% of the chance. I don't like people who are such absolutists. I will never do this, or I will win. I'm going to come in first. I don't like those absolutist terms in politics.
But the door is open a little bit.
Not very much. It really isn't. I don't play. Tim, we just raised $10 million in 2 days. We haven't even had a race. We have February 5th coming up. We have a campaign to run. Why do you ask all the other candidates? How many other candidates have you asked, are you going to run as a third-party candidate if you don't win? Have you asked John McCain that?
Well, if someone has a history of running as a third-party candidate, sure. 1988 as a libertarian.